So I bought this costume expecting to do some kind of skit or bit at the beginning of this episode, but I couldn't think of anything to write, and now I can't return it because we're too close to Halloween. So I'm just gonna be wearing this in the video. Gotta take this wig off though. Can I be honest? You know, I went to school for political science, and to this day, there's a big thing I kind of just don't get. Now, you've read the title and you've seen the outfit, so let's just cut to the chase. What exactly does the Supreme Court do? We all learn about the Constitution and the separation of powers, that Congress passes laws and the president enforces them, but how come every once in a while, there's some crazy Supreme Court decision that just seems to change the law in a pretty drastic way? Sure, sometimes it's in favor of things I want them to do, but not always. How come this unelected group of people we barely hear from has so much power over gay marriage and abortion? Have they always been this unpopular? And if they are so unpopular, why can't Congress just override them? After all, they're the ones we elected. I wanted to figure out exactly what powers these guys are given in the Constitution, what keeps them in check, and how they might lose that power in the near future, and what that might mean for us. Now, when the founders wrote the Constitution, they gave the Supreme Court a sentence. Literally one. Quote, "The judicial power shall be vested in one Supreme Court." There wasn't any mention of striking down laws, future instructions, or anything else. They pretty much just said to figure it out. So for the first decade of the country, the court was kind of a side character. I mean, they met in the basement of the Capitol. They were effectively ignored by presidents and Congress. But that changed in 1803 with a case called Marbury v. Madison. Now, if you remember any cases from high school government class, there's a good chance this is one of them. The case starts with paperwork. John Adams, on his last night as president, appoints a bunch of judges to lock in power for his party. But when Thomas Jefferson takes office, his team refuses to deliver on one of the commissions. So William Marbury sues the new administration, and it lands on the desk of Chief Justice John Marshall. Now, here's the crazy part about this case and why it's still talked about today. Marshall tells Marbury that he's right and the law's on his side. But in the same breath, he says the law itself, part of the Judiciary Act of 1789, is unconstitutional. This was the first time the court declared an act of Congress invalid. Nobody told them that they could do that, but by doing it, they made it true. It's what's called judicial review. The idea that the Supreme Court gets to decide what the Constitution actually means and how the other branches can operate in that. Now, from there, the court builds an empire of precedent. The first is Fletcher v. Peck in 1810, when the court strikes down state law for the first time, setting the precedent that they can, do that. Martin v. Hunter Lacey in 1816. It's when the court says that it can overrule state courts on federal issues. And Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, when the court decides that Congress controls interstate commerce. Each of these cases took a small bite out of state sovereignty and fed federal supremacy. Now, to be fair, it had no way to enforce its decisions. It couldn't raise money or send troops anywhere, but it could say no to Congress, to the president, to the states, and that no would stick if everyone agreed to that rule. So it seems like the court's power isn't about action, but interpretation, right? And once the country agreed that interpretation was binding, that was it. So given all that insane power, what's stopping them? You know what? I nearly forgot the most important power the Supreme Court has is starting a Patreon. What's that? The court didn't start a Patreon, I started a Patreon? My bad, sorry, genuine mistake, but I did. If you want to see these videos early, take a minute and subscribe to either my Patreon or join my YouTube membership. I make more money on the Patreon. I recently started making these videos full time, so any support you could give would really go a long way. Anyways, I'm not gonna ramble on. Let's get back to the court. So if the Supreme Court can say that the Constitution means whatever they want it to mean, who exactly keeps them in check? Can they strike down a law Congress passes and Congress can't really overrule them? Isn't that kind of dangerous? It turns out the founders did think about that, just not very clearly. The court's power might look absolute on paper, but in practice, there are a bunch of ways, big and small, to keep it in line. The first one is kind of obvious: the Constitution itself. More specifically, constitutional amendments. In order to pass one, you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of states to agree, which hasn't happened on any issue in well over 30 years. But it has happened. After the court said states could be sued without their consent, Congress passed the 11th Amendment to undo it. After Dred Scott v. Stanford basically said Black Americans couldn't be citizens, the 14th Amendment not only undid it, but gave them equal protection under the law. Later, when the court struck down an income tax, Congress came back with the 16th Amendment, explicitly granting themselves the power to tax income. Did you know we didn't have an income tax until the 1900s? I have a whole video about it right up here. So Congress can overrule the courts, but it takes a huge national movement. Seemingly partisan decisions wouldn't make it through this route. There's also the impeachment route. Technically, justices serve during good behavior, which means they can be impeached. But that's only happened once. Justice Samuel Chase got impeached in 1804 because he was being a little too loud about his Federalist politics. The Senate acquitted him, and ever since it's been basically understood that you don't impeach a justice because you don't like their rulings. No one's ever been removed from the court that way. Now, however, Congress does control the size of the court. The Constitution doesn't say there have to be 9 justices. That's just where it's been since 1869. At different points, there were 6, 7, 10, kind of just whatever Congress decided. If you want to change the type of decisions a court's making, just appoint a bunch of your own people and drown them out. That's what Franklin Roosevelt tried to do. It was during the Great Depression. The Supreme Court kept striking down FDR's New Deal programs that are supposed to pull Americans out of economic collapse. So Roosevelt basically says, fine, if the courts are too out of touch, let's add a new justice for everyone over 70 who won't retire. That would have taken the court from 9 to 15 justices, basically letting him flood it with allies. Now, the plan blew up in his face. Congress and the public hated it. But a strange thing started to happen. The court stopped blocking New Deal laws. Historians called it the switch in time that saved 9. So even though FDR's plan failed, the threat alone worked. That pressure is what you might call an informal check. The Supreme Court watches the political weather closely. If it pushes too far, talk of retaliation will pop up. New amendments, new laws, changing its structure, maybe stripping the jurisdiction over certain issues. And the court knows that its authority depends on everyone believing it's legitimate. If public trust collapses, so does its power. It's a really weird balancing act. The justices have lifetime appointments and can't be voted out, but they still have to read the room. The institution survives by constantly negotiating its image with the public. So now that we know how they can be reeled in, at least in theory, let's revisit the question from earlier again. What do these people actually do? We should make this clear up top. The Supreme Court doesn't write laws, and it doesn't enforce them either. It interprets them. I know we've said that before, but we have to make that clear. When someone brings a case claiming that a law or a government action violates the Constitution, the court decides who's right, and that decision becomes precedent, the new rule everyone else follows. The court can't tell Congress what to pass or the president what to do, but if it declares something unconstitutional, it effectively erases it from the system. And since the Constitution is vague by design, these interpretations make it so both sides can form separate arguments for whether or not a law should stand from their own interpretation of the Constitution. So if you really want to see what the Supreme Court does, you have to look at the moments when it steps into a fight and changes the rules of the game. I think the easiest way to get a sense of the power the court has is to look at some key cases in recent presidential administrations on different issues. Let's start with a very popular case called Bush v. Gore in 2000. The presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore came down to a few hundred votes in Florida. Now, it was a really messy recount with different counties using different rules to count ballots, and the whole thing was on the verge of seeming like collapse. And so the Supreme Court stepped in and in a 5-4 decision stopped the recount altogether. Basically, they were saying that the different counting methods meant that some votes were being treated unfairly. But the result of the decision was that they effectively handed the presidency to George Bush. So when looking back on this case today, a lot of experts see it as the time when the court went from being seen more as a referee of the system to the institution that was making decisions, like who ran the country. Obviously, that's kind of anecdotal, but the majority added a weird disclaimer, saying that the ruling was a one-time only situation, as if to admit how extreme it was. Justice John Paul Stevens wrote in a dissent that, quote, "The loser is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law." And that moment shattered the illusion of neutrality for a lot of Americans. The idea that a court stood above politics, really. But anyway, let's move on to the next case, which takes place about a decade later, called the National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius in 2012. This one is less known by name, but it's the case that decided the fate of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. The question was, could Congress require Americans to buy health insurance? Congress seemed to say yes, that under its power to regulate interstate commerce. The conservative justices said no, though. They said the Commerce Clause doesn't let Congress regulate what people don't do. It seemed like the end of the Affordable Care Act, but then Chief Justice John Roberts pulled off one of the strangest pivots in modern court history. He agreed Congress couldn't force people to buy insurance under the Commerce Clause, but he kind of pivoted and also said that the penalty for not buying it was technically a tax, and that Congress absolutely has the power to tax. Now, that one word, tax, basically saved the entire law. It was a middle path that upheld Obama's signature policy without expanding federal power too far, according to the court. Some people would call that judicial restraint. Other people still considered it politics as normal. And then our last example for right now, it's Biden v. Nebraska from 2023. It was the student loan forgiveness case. Now, if you remember, the Biden administration tried to cancel up to $20,000 in student loan per borrower. They tried to use a post-9/11 law meant for emergencies called the HEROES Act, arguing that the pandemic qualified as an emergency. The court, in a 6-3 decision, said absolutely not. Chief Justice Roberts wrote that the law didn't give the Education Department anywhere near that kind of authority. He invoked something called the Major Questions Doctrine, which I'm not a constitutional scholar here, but to my understanding basically says that if an agency wants to do something huge and economically significant, Congress has to say so clearly. Congress didn't, so the program was struck down. The logic here wasn't really about debt, more about power. The court was drawing a line by saying the executive branch can't make trillion-dollar decisions without new legislation. But to millions of student loan borrowers who were promised relief, it looked like 6 unelected justices took away a promise that the president made to them. So across all 3 cases, you can see how the court touches every branch of government. In one, it decided a presidential election. In another, it decided if Congress could enact a law it passed. And in the third, it told the executive branch what it could and couldn't do. None of these cases involved writing a law or enforcing one, but effectively had similar sway, impact, and power. So where are we now? The court's recent decisions and the public's reaction to them have raised a much bigger question. What happens when people stop believing the court's rulings are legitimate? That they're all politically motivated and not based in any larger academic sense? What happens when the quiet agreement that we've had for 200 years, that whatever the court says goes, starts to break down? The Supreme Court today sits at one of the strangest positions in American history. It has never had more power, but it's never been less trusted. Polls show public confidence is at historic lows, which is wild for an institution that, in theory, can overrule both the president and Congress. The Supreme Court's authority depends entirely on belief. It has no army, no police, no budget. Its power comes from everyone acting like its word is final. The second that understanding breaks, things unravel very quickly. Now, we've seen hints of this before. In 1832, when the court ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that Georgia couldn't impose state law on Cherokee land, President Andrew Jackson basically shrugged. There's a line he's famous for, which I'll say we don't have a direct quote for. Nonetheless, it goes, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Now, even though it might not be entirely correct, the sentiment was. Georgia ignored that ruling, and the result was the Trail of Tears. Now, the law was powerless without the will to enforce it. Fast forward to 1957. Brown v. Board of Education has outlawed segregation, but Arkansas Governor Orville Fabeau, I think that's how it's pronounced, still blocked Black students from entering Little Rock Central High. It took federal troops, not lawyers, to enforce the court's decision. If President Eisenhower had felt differently that day, things could have gotten much worse. So here's the question creeping into mainstream conversation now. What happens when the public, or the states, or even the president just stops listening? The groundwork is already there. J.D. Vance, the current vice president, saying the following.
For me, this is not a limited government thing. This is a democracy thing. Like, you need a bureaucracy to be responsive to the elected branches of government. The counterargument is, aren't you promoting a constitutional crisis? And my response is no, I'm recognizing a constitutional crisis. If the elected president says, I get to control the staff of my own government, and the Supreme Court steps in and says, you're not allowed to do that, that is the constitutional crisis. It's not whether Trump or whoever else does in response. When the Supreme Court tells the president he can't control the government anymore, we need to be honest about what's actually going on.
The more the court looks partisan, the easier it becomes for everyone else to treat it that way too. The thinking goes, if they're political actors, why not play politics back? But there's something I want to bring up I don't think you hear often, and it's that some scholars think that might not be such a bad idea. Legal historian Mark Tushnet argues that America has given its judiciary much too much power. That by handing constitutional interpretation over to 9 unelected lawyers, we've weakened democracy itself. Political philosopher Jeremy Waldron, he makes a similar case. In many countries, the courts have significantly less power. Canada, the UK, New Zealand all have systems where the courts can review laws, but Parliament can overrule them much easier. It's called parliamentary sovereignty, that the law of the legislature is the supreme legal authority. No court can invalidate an act of Congress. Now, this obviously comes with its own downsides, and some countries like Canada have a middle ground compromise because of that. But the idea is that disagreement belongs in politics, not in the courtroom. In that view, a government without a Supreme Court is actually, dare I say, maybe more democratic. That argument hits harder when you realize how political the modern court already is. Every confirmation hearing sounds like a proxy election. The justices are appointed for life, which means the real battle happens decades before most rulings ever do. President Trump's last 3 appointments were all confirmed on the thinnest of margins and cemented a conservative supermajority that is likely to last a generation. And when that majority overturned Roe v. Wade, undoing 50 years of precedent, the shock was as much about abortion as it was realizing that precedent itself was not sacred. Okay, so right now there are 4 big reform ideas on the table. Term limits, a binding code of ethics, jurisdiction limits, and a court expansion. Now, term limits are the most popular. A study from the University of Pennsylvania shows roughly 68% of Americans think justices shouldn't serve for life. Proposals vary, but the leading one would give each justice an 18-year term, with new appointments every 2 years. That would regularize nominations and cool the confirmation war. And it ensures each president gets the same number of picks. And the great thing about this is it doesn't require a constitutional amendment. Congress could plausibly do it by statute, though it would almost certainly end up in the Supreme Court. Okay, but then there's the ethics issue. For the first time ever, the court adopted a code of conduct in 2023. Now, it was mostly because reporters kept uncovering luxury trips, gifts, and undisclosed real estate deals involving some justices. But the new code has no enforcement mechanism. So the debate is now whether Congress can or should impose binding ethics rules the way it does for lower court judges. The third idea is jurisdiction stripping. It's the notion that Congress can limit what kind of cases the court is allowed to hear. Article 3 gave Congress that power, and it's been used before. During Reconstruction, lawmakers actually revoked the court's jurisdiction over certain case topics to protect their Reconstruction acts. It is a blunt instrument, but it's one that the Constitution clearly allows. There's some legal scholars that think it could be revived to keep politically explosive cases like election disputes out of the court's reach altogether. And of course, the fourth and final option, the nuclear option, expanding the court. As we already went over, Roosevelt tried this and it failed. Today, the idea is back in progressive circles. You can add 4 new justices to, quote, rebalance the court. Now, there's a pretty strong argument that this may start a spiral, with every new majority adding seats until the court becomes like a mini Congress. So those are 4 reforms, but none of them are easy. All would face legal challenges, political gridlock, or both. But the fact that they're being talked about at all is telling. For most of American history, the Supreme Court was considered untouchable. The founders built a system of checks and balances, but over time, the court slipped out of balance. Now with the internet and constant news, that mystique is fading, and it's being replaced by something both scarier, but also like more democratic, right? It's visibility. The justices are now public figures. The marble curtain, or whatever you want to call it, it's gone. What's left is raw politics. But still, there's a deeper philosophical question under all this if nothing changes. If the court loses its legitimacy entirely, what comes next? Some scholars argue we'd adapt, Congress would legislate more clearly, presidents would rely less on executive action, and constitutional disputes would play out in public instead of behind closed doors. But others warn that without a final arbiter, the system could fracture, with every state interpreting the Constitution in its own way. The court might be flawed, but it's also the glue that stops presidents and Congress from overreaching. So I guess kind of like in sum, the Supreme Court's strength is also its greatest weakness. Again, it only works if everyone believes it does. I know I keep saying that, but it's super important. Belief is a fragile thing. It can't be mandated. It has to be earned over and over again. Every branch depends on restraint. The Supreme Court just happens to depend on it the most. The Constitution doesn't guarantee that the court will be supreme. So as long as people keep questioning where the lines are, I think it means the lines still mean something. If the court stops listening or we ever stop caring, that's when the balance would break. Until then, 9 voices on a bench in DC get to say what the law is, and the rest of us, for better or worse, decide whether to believe them. That choice is up to you.